here, and a little bit of you is going, architecture, and some of it's going, oh, I didn't get breakfast, and some of it's going, oh, I was out really late last night, and some of it's going, oh, I left my room untidy, oh, I can't believe I've got to go back to that mess, and then I've got boyfriend trouble, a girlfriend trouble, or I can't find the rent. That's what's really in your heads, none of this. But you've got to pull this bit to the front, because this is going to give you a career and a life. But the more you present yourself as a human being, present yourself as a human being, right? First and foremost. And the people who you are talking to, remember, first and foremost, they are human beings. They're not just cost consultants or structural engineers. They've got all this same crazy stuff in their head as you have. Should we finish it there?
Yeah. That's great. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm so grateful, Mike, because that is really what it's like out there. I, with contractors, very much don't put myself on a pedestal, because next day you're going to make some almighty cock-up. And when I make a cock-up, I say, guys, I've made a cock-up here. And then they go, okay, well, let's see how we can sort it out. If you put yourself on a pedestal, no chance.
They will fry you.
Yeah. Notes, in front of a client, I am always making notes. In fact, in tutorials, I'm always making notes. Clients don't mind that. They think it's good that you're making notes. The other thing that Mike was saying with a client that he made you rehearse, that's a good idea. When I'm in a tutorial with you guys, although I'm not teaching in third year at the moment, you have some crazy, crazy notion. My first reaction is honestly to go, oh, that's interesting. I've not thought of that before. Because my first reaction is, you might have thought of some genius solution I've never ever thought of before. And same with the client. First reaction should be, well, that's a good idea, or that's an interesting idea, and let's explore it. So thanks ever so much, and I will see you anon.
Yeah. I'll see you after another 1,000 cock-ups.
Okay, thanks for coming. Thank you. Right, okay guys, now I'm afraid there is going to be an intermission enforced by the powers that be. Oh no, where's it gone? There it is. Guess what? A 5-minute intermission. I'm sorry about this. And while you're doing it, anybody who hasn't done it, log in now, please. And as a special treat, while you're doing it, I will scan through a load of posters from previous years. How many people haven't done it yet? Hands up. Hands up, hands up, hands up. Yeah, quite a few. So there, off you go. It's no more than 5 minutes. Okay, and then we've got the other. There's about a third of this lecture left. So it'll only take 15 minutes after we stop. So here we go. I put some general ones in. This is to remind you that impact and graphic quality is a third of the marks. It's on the London Underground. It's meant to be engaging or fun or funny. Because you can put all the detail stuff to tell me how clever you are on the A4 sheet. You don't have to put the stuff on the poster to tell me how clever you are. The poster is to get an idea across. film posters, amazing. There's some real classics you all will notice as we go through. And of course, there have been some students in the past who've taken these and tweaked them for an architectural message. Mischievously, but they got good marks. Oh, yes. Where are those people? Any of them in? Can you bloody well tell me what you want to do? Just shout it down. What subject is it? Oh, sorry. Okie dokie. So you, Francesco? Yeah. Okay, let's go back to the lecture. So have you all done your student jobby? Oh, I was supposed to tell you things. I was supposed to tell you that this affects our ranking as a university. So when you're trying to get a job in 3 years, and Liverpool's taken a dive because no one could be bothered to fill this in, it'll reflect on you. It's meant to also feed back to the government about the QA systems here. And again, if we don't fill it in, it doesn't matter. You just have to be honest. You have to give honest feedback. But if we don't fill it in, we don't do well. And then, of course, it's in all the university guides, The Guardian, The Times, etc., etc. And so all those little mummies and daddies out there with their precious little kiddies read those guides to decide where they're going to go. In terms of good things, what I've been told to say is we believe we make a big effort on feedback after you've done projects. At this place, you have a good staff-student ratio. 12:1 is a good ratio compared to a lot of places. It's very rare to everybody get a place in the studio, which you do here, and many places don't have that. And I'm told to tell you that the staff make things sound interesting. I don't know whether that's true, but you can put that on. Right, okay, so I'm going to carry on now. So we got to the end of design build, and you remember how you can't keep a control on figures when you start changing things. Partnering. So it sounds great because basically you're all working together collaboratively, and because the contractor's involved early days, it means that those estimates can be done by the contractor, which tend to be more accurate than those that are done by a quantity surveyor. It's possible sometimes to start work before all the detailed drawings are done. And this is the way they work in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, they can start doing an enormous 50-floor block of flats before it's even got planning permission. They start putting in the piles in the ground. The disadvantages are that if you're working for a really hard-nosed board of governors, like I have done working for universities and schools, they don't feel you can prove that you've got the best possible deal. Sometimes it can be difficult to choose the right team. Because you're interviewing a contractor on the basis of his past record and what he says at an interview and how nicely he comes across, you might get a horrible shock a third the way through the job when you actually find he's only interested in the money. One of the big disadvantages is that you can get started on a job and you aren't necessarily sure on the price at the outset, but you're making a big commitment to the job. And so, for all of those reasons, you need to have a really good project manager, whether it's the architect or not. We need someone who's keeping control of things over and above the contractor, and that is a real skill. So management contracting, do you remember I explained you're giving the person a fee for managing the project and he's getting prices from all the subcontractors. The advantage is you can start early with maybe only the foundations package in place. You can make changes and they can be assessed and you can be pretty flexible. You know what the management costs are, they're fixed, and then everything else you can see where your money's going. So you can keep moving and you could tweak the quality of things towards the end of the job if you're running out of money. The disadvantages are, and this is a big disadvantage, the final project cost is not known until the last subcontract price is priced, and that might be something to do with light fittings or decorations or soft furnishings. It can be possible to be committed to a job because you've said we're going to build this whole residence, but then you run out of money and you can't finish the job. It can seem expensive to employ that contractor to do all of this, and some people don't like that because you're disclosing that this contractor wants $400,000 for his management costs. Some of your governors might say, whoa, that sounds like a lot of money just to tell him to manage things. Whereas, when you traditionally tender things, they're all hidden. All those costs are hidden. And finally, it takes a lot of trust, because you're going to trust that contractor to continually be working in your best interest and do things properly. So you need to make absolutely sure when you interview early days that you've got the right person. Hubs and frameworks. So the advantage is that the client can form a relationship with a limited number of contractors, and they hopefully are very loyal to them. You can get off the starting blocks very, very quickly with projects because you only need to do a little mini competition, not produce a whole big specification. So if you suddenly find you've got £2 million you've got to spend before April, you can get going with it really quickly. You can get input from the contractors at an early stage. So the contractor might say, well, building next to that river is going to be really tricky and I don't know where I'm going to put my site cabin and all that sort of thing, which you might never have thought of as the architect. And you can tie them in to their rates for a period. So having got all these contractors and they're declaring all their rates for various different activities, they could be fixed for 3 years, so you know where you're standing. The disadvantages are that they tend to be, the designs tend to be contractor driven. So as an architect, and we do a lot of work for Cheshire County Council. Cheshire County Council have these contracting hubs, and what it means is that the contractor is very much in the driving seat with regard to the development of their schools programme, which can be a bit boring because the contractor won't allow you to do really innovative or extravagant things, which might be completely appropriate when you're dealing with a school. It can be difficult if quality is high on the agenda. So if you were doing a whole load of art galleries, it would almost certainly not be the most appropriate medium. And then finally, there's a suspicion that the client isn't getting good value for money. So the work we do at Cheshire, they get these various schools built or extensions built, and everybody works collaboratively together. But if a school has their own money and they can do it off-grid, they can do it not as one of those tendering hubs, those head teachers tell us that they can sometimes get a building 5 or even 10% cheaper per square metre than they pay when they're doing it on the tendering hub. So that's the sort of ad hoc feedback that we get. So those are the different procurement routes: traditional, design build, management contracting, partnering. And the most important thing to remember is the difference between traditional and design build. So now project management, that's what it is: planning, organising, motivating, controlling, to achieve a defined objective. Those are the 5 stages of project management. Initiating is what do you want to wish for. So quite often clients need the handheld when they're thinking, well, this is what we want to do. We want to do this outdoor pursuit centre out in the hills, and we think it needs this, this and this, and you might help them with that. Then you've got to plan it. So over what period, when's it got to be open, who do we need to help us with it? Do we need a structural engineer? Do we need a planning consultant? Then there's the execution. Once you've got all your ducks lined up and you've got all the people that you need in order to do it, you've got to execute it successfully. So there's a certain amount of management required to make sure everybody does everything at the right time in terms of both the design team and also the construction team. Then there's the monitoring and controlling. So once you've got going, the obvious thing is once you've got going on site, you need to make sure that things are being built the way you want them to be built, to the quality you expect them to be built. And so there's a monitoring process going on there. But there's also a monitoring process goes on through the first 6 or 12 months as you're working as a design team. You're checking that everybody's doing the things they said they would do on time. So you'll have a great big Gantt chart showing all the activities, and you'll check each month to see where everybody's up to. And that will include the client. So if the client is being very slow in making decisions, it may well be that will have an effect on everything else. And finally, closing. So for us, that means practical completion, but there might be other things. So once the job is finished, particularly if it's a design-build job, you may have the keys ready and you hand them to the client. And at the point you hand them to the client saying, it's your building, off you go, you will need to check that it's all been done at the right standard, that it has got a fire certificate, that the water has been chlorinated. All sorts of things need to have happened before you say, I'm happy with that building. And that's all called closing. So those are the essential 5 steps of project management which affect each and every project. And that doesn't matter whether it's a building project or whether it's BAE Systems selling fighter jets to the Saudi Arabian government. It covers lots of projects and how they get done. You'll remember the RIBA plan of work as we've covered before. And I don't know why I put that up actually. Well, that's the process, isn't it? So for us as architects, our specific process is that RIBA plan of work. If you're selling fighter jets to the Saudi government, it's going to be a different plan of work. But for us as architects, that's the thing that every project goes through. So in terms of project management, the measurement is both in terms of things that are happening with the contractor and also things that are happening with us as designers. What quality is the output required and where are we up to? So the stuff that Marco is doing now with the School of Architecture, he has given those 5 architects a brief now. In a month or two's time, they're going to come back with proposals and he is going to assess how have their proposals matched the brief he gave them. It's all very well at looking lovely, but actually has it got this sort of a studio and that sort of a lecture theatre and this sort of a seminar room against the criteria he has set them. The next one, where do we plan to be? So this is where you're going to check each month where everybody's up to against a master programme. And that's both the client, the architect, the contractor, evaluate where they're up to. And finally, if there's a variance from where you should be to where you are, so supposing you're a month behind with your project, what can we do to try and overcome that? Now, quite often, and this is a very sad fact of life, very often it's impossible to pull that month back. But it may well be, if it's important enough, that there are things you could do by working 24/7 or something like that to pull it back on track. But you would have to report back to the client and say, well, look, we're a month late because we had all of this frosty weather, but what we're going to do is we're going to do this, this and this and we're going to do our best to get it back on programme. The three aspects of project management are quality, time and cost, which we have covered before. What are we trying to achieve in terms of standards, and what either specification or key performance indicators are we going to provide to monitor the quality against. The time is obviously the big programme. It'll have an end date, it'll have intermediate end dates when we have to get certain things done in order to meet the objectives. And finally, the cost. And so that is both the budget, the capital cost, and the cost in use. And there may even be best value assessments in order to prove that you've done things which are in the client's best interest. As part of project management, partly at the design stage, but very much so at the construction stage, if you end up working for a design build contractor, there is a thing called a responsibility matrix, which is a great big chart which lists all the things that have to be done and then who is responsible for doing them. So as the architect and team leader, you're very often mentioned in a lot of those boxes, even if you have to make the architect aware of it. What's important is to know who is responsible for what, and make damn sure as the architect that you ensure they have the information at hand so they can assess things and give you the feedback. It's a good idea to set that out at the start, but very often it only comes into the fray about halfway through the job once detailed design starts taking place. So those are the 4 levels of involvement. 1 is you're responsible for the design. 2 is you're responsible for coordinating the design, which is very often the case as the architect. The next is you have to be consulted. So if the acoustician is using this sort of perforated stuff like we've got on the back wall, well actually as an architect I'd like to be consulted on those perforations because they have an impact on the visual appearance of the building. And finally, that you have to be advised. And there may be things where the architect has to be advised that certain decisions are being made, even though you have no part in those decisions or they're not important. So those are the 4 levels of involvement. Finally, the owner of a particular element. So, for instance, the design of the structural frame, the owner would be the structural engineer, and everybody else would be consulted to make sure that the beams aren't too big or the columns aren't in the middle of a window, but the owner would be the structural engineer. As an architect, it's easy to think that you are basically in control and responsible for everything, and that certainly is the way you're encouraged to think at university. But in real life, you see that little quip there, that architects are like Boy Scouts with a power complex, and that's not always a good thing, because you may take responsibility for things which you are simply not equipped to take responsibility for. So where there are things which are other people's responsibility to do with, I don't know, the reverberation time in this room or the level of illumination at the working plane, you will make absolutely clear to the acoustician reverberation time is down to him, and you'll make clear to the MEP person that the level of illumination at the working plane so people can read their books is down to them. When you're getting advice, it's very important to understand the status of that advice, i.e., can you rely upon it? So, I keep talking about those frameless glazed shop fronts down at Liverpool 1, and 4 metres high, and they have to deal with the wind loading on them. If Pilkington's little fella came along from Pilkington's and he said, yeah, if you just put a fin that's about 400 deep and it's cleated onto that thing, it'll resist the wind. But he never actually put that in writing, or you never really tied that down, and then the window caves in because there's a gale and the whole thing collapses, you're high and dry. If you're going to act on advice from Pilkington's, you need it in writing, and you need to know that they fully understand all the criteria against which you're working. It's important when contractors and suppliers do not have design responsibilities. So, if you're doing a traditionally procured job where you have to give them all the information, and the contractor says to you, do you know what, I wouldn't bother with a 140 block wall there. A 100mm block wall will be just fine. Trust me, I've done it lots of times. Well, if you change and then that wall gets pushed over because people are larking about in the room and it collapses, well, it'll be your head on the block because you're responsible for designing it, not the contractor. The fact that the contractor said, oh, I've used a 100mm block loads of times, it'll be just fine, that's not of interest to you. You have to know when you're responsible for design and when you're not. And finally, when a company goes bust. So in your year out, if you are working for people like Mike in smaller practices, they very often use a thing called a contractor design supplement. And what this is even when it's a traditionally procured project, you can backhill the design of certain elements to a supplier or a contractor. Now, this is the typical one for this is truss rafters. So you know when you're doing ordinary houses, the roof, if it's a pitched roof, is very often made of truss rafters. And when you actually see them in real life, they're the skimpiest things made of the most awful thin bits of wood. But basically that person has been making truss rafters for the last 30 years. They work, they've tested them, and that's fine. So now here's the thing. Imagine there's a big gale in Liverpool and a big terrace of houses, the roof collapses. The wind loading on that roof causes the whole roof to collapse. And you think, well, that's okay because Joe Blogg's truss rafters, they designed those for me and they supplied them. So now I'll phone them up and get them down to sort this thing out. You phone them up and you find that they went bust 2 years ago. They're no longer trading. What do you do now? Who do you blame now? Who sorts the problem out? Well, guess what? It's you, the architect, because you're the last person standing. You're the person with indemnity insurance, and the client will have recourse to come to you and say, you sort that roof out. You trusted those people. They're not here anymore, are they? You sort it out. So it's okay using design portion supplements, but it sometimes can be risky if that company or subcontractor is not there in the future to be blamed. Cost control, we've dealt with this really. It's merely just to remind you how important costs are to clients, to remind you of that Egan report with dissatisfaction with architects' performance, and to make sure that you have qualifications when you toss figures around, or else the client will hold you to them. You said, I could build this house for $500,000 6 months ago, now it's costing 650,000. You say, whoa, just a minute. I said we could probably do it for $500,000 based on this cost per square metre. We've now got a lot more detail and that's why it's costing more money. And so we always work from the general to the specific, and the best possible test for the cost of a building is the contractor's price. Until you've got that contractor's firm price, everything else is a guess. And it can be a guess plus or minus 10% or even plus or minus 20%. But once you've got a price from a contractor who's prepared to build it, that's the actual firm price. And the thing about using specialists, which Mike didn't mention, but the reason that QS is our friend is they can avoid us doing abortive work. Because if this thing increases in price and you haven't warned the client, then you will have to do a value engineering exercise and change the drawings later on at your expense, in your weekend or whatever. Whereas if the cost consultant has advised all the way along and the client said, yes, carry on, then they will have to honour the proposal you have produced. I don't think I have covered this, but basically when tenders come back, you then get 5, you can imagine, 5 sets of paper, and contractors are terrible people. They're forever putting in qualifications or saying I can get hold of this roof tile cheaper than that roof tile, even if you haven't asked them to, and they'll put a bottom line. So you have to go through all of their information to look out for anomalies once you get the prices back, and you can be confident that they're all comparing the same products. Provisional sums are things where you haven't designed the reception counter yet, so I'm going to chuck 5,000 quid in for a reception counter and then we'll sort it out later. And people do this a lot. The snag with that is that just when you come to finally draw up the reception counter halfway through the job, because you've now got time to do it, and it comes back at 6,500, the client's going to say, whoa, well, I haven't got another 1,500. You put in a provisional sum of 5,000, you'd better do a reception counter now for that or less. I'm not interested in it being more money. So provisional sums are risky. We will cover the business about instructions in writing in a future lecture, but basically, unless it's in writing, it's meaningless. Saying things verbally, although you can form a contract that way, it's a contract which is fraught with difficulties because people can disagree about what was agreed, so that having things in writing is really important. And finally, just keeping the client informed. So you can inadvertently issue an instruction on site to change something. Maybe change the garden wall from 1.5 metres to 2 metres, and it goes all the way around the edge of the garden. And you think, well, that's sensible because I don't want the neighbours to be able to peep over the wall at 1.5 metres. But actually, all of that brickwork has just cost your client another £5,000. If you wanted to increase the wall, or maybe it's even the client who asked you to increase the wall, you needed to get a price for it first, so that the instruction, you have full knowledge of the financial implication of that instruction. So a happy client is one that gets the project finished on time, on budget, and to a quality at least as good as you hope for. And obviously they want no hassle. And then they'll ask you back again to do the next one. So the summary is, and Mike reinforced this, it's a team effort. And it doesn't pay to set yourself on too much of a pedestal. Recent changes in procurement have made a big difference to the way things are designed. So these jobs that the University of Liverpool are doing, where the contractor is in the driving seat from RIBA Stage 2, that makes quite a big difference to the way we design things, as you'll discover. Design build now represents over half the work in the country, so it's a reality. And those of you who work for bigger practices, and it's very common to work for a bigger practice in year out, that's what you'll find. Project management is all to do with that balance between time, cost and quality. Try and make everybody responsible for what they've got to do, and that money talks as far as clients are concerned. And finally, value engineering. So if you end up having to get the thing back on budget, that can be very time consuming and very distressing. So that's the reading, that's the revision, and I now know about Francesca, thank you. I want you just to remember the target audience with this thing. So I've shown you some fun posters. Who are you imagining looking at your poster? Is it your head teacher? Is it your mother? Is it the bank manager? Is it a business leader? If you look in the brief, it says, think about who's going to be looking at your poster, because half the posters last year were as though you're talking to me, an expert client, an architect. It's not me I want you to communicate with, it's someone in the general public or business community. Yeah, so it's all there, A2, blah, blah, blah. Target audience. So the way we market is three things equal: appropriateness of message, clarity of message, and graphic quality. So we break down your mark in those three components. Beware of using too many words. You can put your words on the A4 sheet. So it's Thursday the 28th, 9:30, and then upload to Vital by 2 o'clock. Okay, thank you very much.